So I cannot think of a better way to start this day than hearing Miss Becca Tarnas share one of her deep and greatest joys and passion. And anytime we get to hear somebody share that, it's such a gift because there's so much more that goes into something that we have passion about than anything else in life, soul and heart and imagination. And I like to gamble. I'm a gambling woman, but I only place bets when I know I'm gonna win. And one bet that I would make on any day is that Becca would absolutely win Lord of the Rings Trivial Pursuit. I know that might offend some of you, even in this audience, but she has my bet. But even more than winning the Trivial Pursuit of Lord of the Rings, Becca, I think, really wins the mythic, poetic imagination and spiritual quest of everything that the archetypal dimension has to offer, and that Tolkien is one vessel through which that's come through. And yeah, it's just such an honor to be able to see you as a living embodiment of so many of the qualities that I hope we all continue to incarnate.
Well said.
Thank you, Jessica. That really means a lot. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Or, as they say in the ancient tongue, Mai Govanen, Ellen Sila Lumen Omenti Elvo, which means, may a star shine on the hour of our meeting. And that is appropriate even for the morning because the day star has just risen. So I'm hoping to take you all on a journey to a place that I think all of you have been in some way or other. This is the world of the imagination, the mundus imaginalis, what J.R.R. Tolkien sometimes called fairy, or as he developed it, called Middle Earth. And I find this word really interesting that he used, fairy. He spelled it F-A-E-R-I-E. It's a much older word than F-A-I-R-Y. And it conveys something of this realm. It conveys fae, that this realm is perilous. He called it the perilous realm. And it's a place that exists between the world of concrete reality and the world of abstract thinking. And it lies between this world of the imagination. And it's a place that I believe Tolkien really walked in. And the trick with going to fairy is not getting there, but coming back. And people can get lost there. As Tolkien said, the keys can become lost, and you cannot return. And I wonder if that is where madness comes from. But if you can go and return, that is one thing. But if you can go, return, and then return again and bring others with you, that is, I think, what Tolkien was doing. So I want to look at some of his theory of imagination and how it is that we get to that realm with him. And I'm going to be using Coleridge as a guide in that as well, looking at his primary and secondary imagination. So first, let me read you a quote from an essay that Tolkien wrote called On Fairy Stories. And this quote actually didn't make it in the final draft, but it so captures what I think Tolkien experienced when he went to fairy. He said, "The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high. In that land, a man, or a woman, may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very mystery and wealth make dumb the traveler who would report. The fairy gold, too often's in parentheses, turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All that I can ask is that you, knowing all these things, will receive my withered leaves, as a token at least that my hand once held a little of the gold." And I believe him. I believe that that is where he went. So what Tolkien was trying to do with his work is he wanted to create a mythology for England. He felt that England didn't have a mythology. He thought the Arthurian legends, they were too recent, they contained Christianity, and therefore they weren't a legitimate mythology. An interesting dismissal for someone who was a devout Roman Catholic, but he dismissed them for that reason. And also because the Arthurian legends weren't written or weren't spoken in a language that was grounded in the British Isles, in the landscape. So he wanted to create a mythology that came out of the landscape, that came out of language. So Tolkien was a philologist professionally, a lover of language. He taught language, he studied etymology. He spoke 19 languages of this world. And he went on to invent another 14 of his own. And it just makes me think of the line from Brian's film last night. What is the creativity that gives birth to 14 invented languages? And that actually gave me a greater understanding on what I'm going to talk about in relationship to Coleridge. So I'll bring that in soon, in that I think this is the cosmic imagination as well, coming through. So he wanted to create a myth for England. And he set about doing that through creating these languages. And out of the languages were then born the peoples and the cultures that arose from the development of the languages. And as he was doing that, he had the sense that he wasn't just making something up. I used this term before, the mundus imaginalis, which is from Henri Corbin. And he uses that term, the world of the imagination, to indicate a difference from not what is just made up. We think of the imaginary as something that is just fanciful, comes off the top of the head, it doesn't exist. So this term, the mundus imaginalis, indicates the reality of that realm, of going into the soul and finding a truth there. And so Tolkien had this sense that he wasn't making something up. Here's a quote from one of his letters, actually. He said he felt he was recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. The thing seems to write itself once I get going, as if the truth comes out then, only imperfectly glimpsed in the preliminary sketch. He had this sense of being directed by a higher power, which is something I think many artists and creative people feel, that it's not just them, it's coming through them. So that leads me to Coleridge, who has his theory of the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. And the primary imagination, in Coleridge's words, and I know Jake has this memorized, the primary imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am, capital I-A-M. And from my understanding of that, that is the imagination of God, or of the cosmos. And what that imagination creates is all that we see. All of reality is created by that imagination. And then, as that comes through the human being, it becomes the secondary imagination, which Coleridge defines as the secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. And it struggles to idealize and to unify. So the secondary imagination, it gives life to what is created, life of its own. So it's, as I see it, the primary imagination moves through the human being and becomes a secondary imagination as the human being, or whoever is creating, becomes conscious of it. He says it is coexisting with the conscious will of the human being. So the secondary imagination is different from the primary imagination in degree, but not kind. And when something's created with the secondary imagination, it is ultimately the primary imagination creating. There's another term that Coleridge uses something he differentiates from the imagination. This he calls fancy. And defines fancy as no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space. So it takes remembered images and kind of puts them back together, but it doesn't have the life that the secondary imagination gives to that recreation. The example I like to think of in regards to Tolkien is Ent. Ent, from the perspective of fancy, are walking, talking trees. Okay, we know what walking and talking are. They're these human things, and we've kind of abstracted that idea, and then trees, we know what trees are, and then we put them together, and we kind of call it this thing. But then when that is given life through the secondary imagination, it becomes Ents, this race of beings that are older than anything else in the world, and they speak in this slow, rhythmic language that is names that have been built up over thousands and thousands of years. And suddenly they're alive, they're their own beings. They're no longer just walking, talking trees, but they're these living creatures. So I think that kind of illustrates some of that difference between fancy and imagination. Tolkien himself actually addressed Coleridge on these ideas, although he did not use him by name, in an essay, the essay I quoted from earlier on fairy stories. And he, for the most part, agrees with Coleridge, but as maybe because he's a philologist and because he can be somewhat ornery with beloved poets and other great thinkers, he wanted to kind of make some changes to this theory. So he felt, yes, the image-making faculty may be more what Coleridge was thinking of as fancy. He calls imagination. Any difference between imagination and fancy is a difference in degree, not kind, for Tolkien. And then what gives the imagination an inner consistency of reality, that thing that breathes life into it, that he calls art. And when you have imagination and art, and they come together, then what is born is what he called a subcreation. And I'm starting to understand that I think subcreation can be used in a similar way as we use the word co-creation. It is created together with archetypal powers, or for Tolkien, created under God, under creation. So created under God. And then the term he used for this subcreative art is fantasy. And as a philologist, probably in a philological jest with Coleridge, he used that term fantasy, which is an older form of the word fancy. So he's trying to redeem fancy and bring it to the level of fantasy. So he called fantasy the making or the glimpsing of other worlds. And in order to be fantasy, as I was saying before, it has to have that inner consistency of reality. It has to have its own laws. It has to be a world that both the designer and the spectator can enter. So he's leading people back into the realm of the imagination. And it has to be presented as truth. It can't be presented as a dream or some other kind of literary device to kind of throw out the imaginative story and say, oh, it was just a dream or a vision that wasn't real. It is real for Tolkien, and that is vital for fantasy to operate for him. So he called this consistency of reality secondary belief, or getting kind of bogged down with the primaries and the secondaries, he also called it enchantment. And so when we enter this realm, we are enchanted. And he said also in this essay on fairy stories, fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal humans, when we are enchanted. So what does that make fairy? Fairy is the real world without the human being. Or, actually, it's the real world without the disenchanted human being. So to enter back into fairy, we have to become enchanted. which is part of what we're all doing in this program. And, okay, so just to go further into subcreation and how it worked for Tolkien, it had two parts for him. On the one side, there was invention. On the other side was inspiration. And as these combined, that's when the subcreative art was born. So I like to think of it as invention is more like fancy, and then inspiration is more like the imagination breathing life into the invention. So he always started with invention. And the way he started with invention was building together his languages. And he built them up from all of his philological research. And an interesting thing about the word invention is that it actually comes from the Latin invenire, which means to find. So again, it starts to explain his experience of not just making up a word, or making up a world, but of discovering it, of finding it. So even his inventing is a finding, but he's finding all these pieces of language and he's changing them and developing them, and out of them grow his mythology. An example of how that started was he found an Old English poem, and 2 lines of it particularly stuck out to him. They were, Eala erendel, engla beartast, offer Middengard monum sended, which means, Hail Erendel, brightest of angels, above Middle Earth, sent unto men. And he used 2 parts of that. Of course, Middle Earth, which comes in a way out of the Norse tradition, Midgard, which was the name for the human realm, between the gods and between the giants and the monsters and trolls. But this other name, Erendil, really became a core part of his mythology, and it was around that he was building. So he'd find, and it became a character that actually, on his journey, ended up sailing into the sky and is what we now call the planet Venus. But I won't go into that. So this is the way he was first inventing and crafting his world. He's drawing on already existing mythologies. He's drawing in elves, and he's drawing in dwarves and dragons and goblins, and they all come together. His languages, the Elvish languages, Quenya is based in Finnish, Sindarin it's based in Welsh, Rohirric is based in Anglo-Saxon. But then they start to gain their own life after that. And this is where the inspiration comes in. He called it when inspiration unites with invention. He called it the fusion point of imagination. And at that fusion point, magic happens. Tolkien wrote in a letter to W.H. Auden, their friends, I dare say something had been going on in the unconscious, he has unconscious in quotes, for some time. And that accounts for my feeling throughout, especially when stuck, that I was not inventing, but reporting imperfectly, and had at times to wait till what really happened came through. And so the example I'd like to give of inspiration is the Hobbits. The Hobbits came fully formed into Tolkien's world, completely unexpectedly. He was grading papers one summer day, and a blank page had been left in the notebook. And as he was looking at it, he suddenly realized that he'd written something on it. And he looked at what he wrote and said, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Well, what's a hobbit? And why did they live in holes? He had no idea who they were. But after he began exploring who they were, he, of course, created some kind of philological grounding for them. He connected it to the Old English word holbitla, which means hole dweller. So it was coming through somewhere. But they came fully formed for him. And what they provide is an entryway into this mythology. He'd been writing for 2 decades the mythology of Middle-earth before the Hobbits came to him. And there was no place to publish this work. There was no interest in it whatsoever. It's completely inaccessible unless you're extremely devoted or slightly weird or something like that. And The Hobbit, in 1937, he published The Hobbit, which he'd written for his children, was unrelated to Middle-earth, People loved it. And there was more demand for work on hobbits. He's like, I have nothing more to say about them. But he was plodding along and trying to write something. And he got the hobbits as far as Bree, for those of you who know the Fellowship of the Ring. He got them as far as Bree. And he said, I have no idea where we are, what's going to happen. I don't know what happened to Gandalf. I don't know who this Strider is. And then this dark horseman appears on the road. And he thinks, oh, maybe it's Gandalf in disguise. And then he realized it wasn't. It was something much darker. And then he realized he wasn't writing a story for children. And then he realized that he had, with his hobbits, walked into this world that he had been building for 2 decades through the languages that he'd been writing.
So just what year was that? Do you know?
That happened.
That realization?
That would have been in the early 40s. Yeah. He wrote The Lord of the Rings for 12 years. It was published in the mid-50s. And what the hobbits provide, they're more human than the men of Middle-earth. They're much more modern than anyone else in Middle-earth. And so they're our eyes into the world, and we can go with them. And that was this moment of pure inspiration. That was what allowed him to bring others back to Fairy with him. And the reason that when we go to Middle-earth, it feels so real and it stays with us, at least for Tolkien, he felt that the reason this happens is because we as human creators, or as human sub-creators, are creating under God, and God is creating through us. And God can imbue our creations with life, if that is meant to be. And what is amazing is that as we read it, Tolkien felt that fantasy, the best form for fantasy was literature, that it should be written, because, as he wrote, every hearer of the words will have his own picture, and will be made out of all the hills and rivers and dales he has ever seen, but especially out of the hill, the river, the valley, all archetypal, which were for him the first embodiment of the word. And so it's a third layer of imagination, that we imagine that world, and it becomes ours as we read his words. And he said, fantasy remains a human right. We make it in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And I'll just finish by reading part of an exchange, 2 letters, that someone wrote Tolkien trying to explain his experience of being in his world and what it meant for him. It was in the last years of Tolkien's life, and this man, he classified himself as an unbeliever, or at best a man of belatedly and dimly dawning religious feeling. But you, he said, the person writing the letter, create a world in which some sort of faith seems to be everywhere without a visible source, like light from an invisible lamp. And Tolkien said, I can only answer, of his own sanity, no man can securely judge. If sanctity inhabits his work, or as a pervading light illumines it, then it does not come from him, but through him. And you would not perceive it in these terms unless it was with you also. Okay, I will end there. Thank you. We have 5 minutes if anyone has any questions.
Can't wait till you do a course on this. I'll be the first to sign up.
That would be my dream. Yes.
So I know you're familiar with through Tolkien and also knowing a little bit about Barfield, the way the language of the evolution of consciousness is affected by changes in language, right? Mm-hmm. And I found it curious that invention, the Latin means to find, which is the opposite of the meaning that most people understand in modern English. Similarly, the word fact means to make in Latin, And somehow, I wonder if this reversal of the meaning of these two words has anything to do with disenchantment. Right? Like somehow we got confused about what's make-believe and what's discovered and found in reality.
I'm glad you brought up Barfield because, first of all, my understanding of Coleridge is coming through reading Owen Barfield's book, What Coleridge Thought. And Barfield was a friend of Tolkien's. They were part of a literary group called the Inklings, in which was also C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and several others. And they met in Oxford for many years. There's a very amazing book, actually, that Jake recommended to me called Splintered Light, and by a woman named Verlyn Flieger. And she talks about Barfield's idea of language, so whole meanings within words that splinter into other words. And she actually relates how Tolkien was very influenced by this idea, not only in his creation of languages, but how the cultures and the peoples splinter away from one unified whole at the beginning of creation. She's working more with his material in the Silmarillion, that were his decades of writing the mythology before he ever wrote Lord of the Rings. So that idea really influenced him. But yeah, that's an interesting point, absolutely. Yeah.
When you're speaking, I keep getting an image that you shared with me of the light and the prism, and I was wondering if one, you would just kind of share what that is, and maybe if you see how that relates to the primary and secondary imagination, and just because you talked about the splintering of light from the beginning of consciousness.
The idea of splintered light is, I think, my favorite image that I somehow keep applying to every single thing I'm learning in PCC, from how to understand archetypes and to this, and in the image of white light passing through a prism and coming out, refracting into all the different colors. And with Tolkien, it's the idea of sacred light, and as the history of Middle-earth unfolds, the people splinter into these different relationships to light, and their different kind of colors and degrees and so on. So that's his understanding of culture, is that it is a splintering of the primary source into these different peoples and cultures and lands and so on. As it relates to the primary and secondary imagination, as I picture it, I see it as like the imagination of God passing through the human being. I don't want to limit to the human being either. I think this is beyond our species, absolutely. But passing through the human being, and then being flavored by that individual's personality and karma and birth chart, and coming forth as a splintered coloring of that creativity. So it's like one color in the rainbow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was just wondering if you would take it one step further like you have before, and how the splintering of all the different lights through people, those people coming back together to co-create too.
I hadn't related this to Tolkien's work, but yes, that maybe as we work in community together and communion, it's like another prism is there. And so when white light passes through one prism, it refracts into many colors, and if that rainbow goes through another, it comes back as white light. And so I wonder if, as human beings create together, they are not recreating in some form a light of God. So that's the rest of that. Yes.
I just had a couple of comments. I'm really blown away by your presentation. It's just astonishingly rich, and your phenomenology behind it is so profound. So thank you so much for illuminating all this. Something that I have been really struck by listening to your talk is that I know so many of the ideas that you're talking about, even though honestly never read Coleridge. I've never seen his particular way of breaking down the imagination, nor Tolkien's. But I do know some Arabic words. There are Arabic words for everything, all these different categorizations. It's amazing. So fairy is alam al-mital. That's what Corban translated into Latin as mundus imaginalis. And then this, what I think I understand, is secondary imagination's capacity to make living real outside of oneself, sort of publicly. That's called Himma, right? And Hillman has written profoundly about this. Now, there's a poet named Charles Stein who visited us a while ago, and he made a comment that stuck with me. He said, magic is the art of creating ontological shifts in public. And so what you're kind of showing that Tolkien's work is a magical act, literally. And furthermore, Charles Stein talks about, there's a crisis of the loss of a wisdom lineage transmission in Western esotericism. But where he finds it, he says, it sinks into fiction and out again. It goes in and out of fiction, and the goddess doesn't care whether she's fact or fiction. She'll go into the fantastical. And so, in that sense, he finds, he says there is a kind of rumor of an esoteric, a living Western esotericism that you have to find by going into these kinds of fictional magics. So just wanted to make that comment and just say there's so many worlds that are opening up. It's very similar to what you're doing. So
I definitely think that's what drew me to it and what has drawn so many. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is the most, the most copies have been bought, second only to the Bible. So, and I think it holds that sacred text place for a lot of people. In some way or other. We're out of time.